This episode of the Better To podcast is brought to you by Kitty Mystic and DM Needham, author of the Better To Burnout series, which includes her latest releases of Fairy Tales and I Love You and Is Love Just Another High. Hi gang, Donna here. Thanks for tuning into the Better To podcast. Today's guest is Phyllis Leavitt. Phyllis and I talk about her in the latest book that is going to come out next July, called America in Therapy. And we discuss the fact that, well, America might need therapy, which, therapy, we've talked about therapy for several episodes and several seasons of the show. But I think she makes some very valid points. So tune in. Hi, Phyllis. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. How are you?
I am good. I appreciate when you reached out to me and you presented the fact that you had a book and you were talking about therapy and America in Therapy. And one of the questions that popped in my head, and I know this is like right out the gate, I'm going to ask you something really wild, but do you think that part of the reason we have such the mental health crisis that we do nowadays is the fact that we have taken critical thinking away in some aspects?
Well, that's a great question, and it probably has far-reaching tentacles in terms of what you could talk about it. But I do think that it's part of, I talk about the family of America as if it's a family, because what I have learned as a family therapist and as a therapist is that we take our family dynamics with us wherever we go. So whatever we learned and whatever our conditioning has been, most people without some kind of intervention or education or some kind of other, new perspective coming in on them, pretty much take what they've learned out into the world. And that means that we take it into our larger institutions, schools and businesses, and into government and legislatures. And so we play out those family dynamics wherever we go for the most part. And to zero in on your question, some of what happens in the larger family institutions and groupings is a desire to control people and to bend them to the will of those in charge. And that happens, for better or for worse. But when it happens for worse, then you have a limitation on critical thinking. You have a limitation on freedom of thought and freedom of exploration and freedom for, really digging deep and discovering like the roots of things or the best cures for things, because it may threaten the powers that be. And these are dysfunctional family dynamics when that kind of freedom of thought and limitation on discussion of different points of view takes place. And one of the ways to do that is to limit what people are allowed to say and punish people or ostracize them if they give an opposing point of view. So that's a very short answer to a huge question. But
no, because it's a perfect question and it's a perfect explanation, because when you actually look at the dynamics of our world in general, you look at, and nobody jump on me for saying about religion, but I have to say this because at a certain point, there's certain aspects of religion, of government, that is all about power and control. And I'm not against government and I'm not against religion, but you have to look at the bigger picture of how much control are you relinquishing to somebody else. And it's not that like I said, I am not anti-government. That is not what I'm trying to say here. I'm just saying that we need to actually be willing to have critical thinking to be able to see the big picture. And I saw an interesting meme this morning that talked about once, I think it was allegedly by Einstein, but it talked about the fact that once media was controlled by one entity, then we would not be able to have a critical thought because we wouldn't have all the facts.
And I think that's very much what's frightening about what's happened, because we really do need to hear other people's opinions. And one of the many reasons why I wrote my book was to look at what's happening in our country through the lens of what we know happens in healthy families and what happens in dysfunctional and abusive families, so that more people can have an idea of what's actually happening here, because it's psychological. So what you said, I agree with. It's not about government. We have to have some kinds of
Right.
institutions for rules and how we order what happens, and to make perfectly more smooth ways of cooperating with each other for the higher good of everyone, or the best provision for everyone. So it's not essentially about government. It's not essentially about religion. It's about the psychology that we bring to it. It's the state of mind. It's our beliefs about ourselves and about other people. And one of the big issues that we really don't talk about on the national stage this way, which is a very, very important psychological issue, is how do we deal with conflict?
Very true. I mean, especially here, there was a surprising fact not too long ago that came out that America has been at war almost every year since way back when. And it's like, you don't think about it because we don't hear about it. We don't hear about the little conflicts. But at a certain point, do we look at the ramifications of what happens because of this?
That's right.
And the mental health issues. And I mean, this is a very telling thing too. How many times has the government, and I know I sound like I'm rallying against it, but how many times, even in Illinois, we had a governor who defunded mental health? And when you think about it, because I'm looking at a situation with my father, and it's like he was not told or taught that mental health, having good mental health, was something proper. There was always that stigma that something was wrong with them and I can't go talk to somebody. And I think that's a huge part, because we still have that mantra in certain aspects, especially for men,
Right.
that, and I'm going to be blunt, and I'm sorry if it bothers you, that
Doesn't bother
you're
me.
you're that you're a pussy if you have to show your feelings. You're
Right.
not being a man. Why
Mhm.
is that? Why is that?
Why is something feminine has it become something negative and derogatory in the first
Patriarchy.
place?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, we have to ask ourselves all these questions. Language has a huge amount to do with the way we think and feel and see things. And yes, there is a stigma against mental health issues for many reasons. Let me just say a broad thing first, and that is that when I talk about mental health, and what I'm talking about mental health in my book, and as a psychotherapist of over 30 years working with hundreds of people and having done many years of therapy myself as a client, we're not talking about the guy over there that is talking to voices in his head on a street corner. And yes, that person is suffering from a real mental health issue, and I'm not putting that down, but I'm talking about our collective mental health. And that means all of us. Is it mentally healthy that we condone war? Is it mentally healthy that we condone police violence? And I know a lot of people don't, but it's still happening. We're not voting that out of existence. We're not even sometimes allowed to safely demonstrate peacefully against some of the injustices that, if they were perpetrated on us personally, we would be outraged.
Mhm.
And yet we condone as a nation, and we condone as parties and gender groups and religious organizations and economic groups and you name it, we condone things that we would never want to have happen to us. And that is a mental health issue.
Well,
It's
do you
not an ideological issue. It's a mental health issue.
It is. And this is something I didn't mean to catch up, but
No, no,
there's this fact, okay, because yes, I'm not a young one. I remember the Vietnam War. I mean, I was a little tot, but I remember them saying on the news, if you have small children or sensitive people, please remove them from the room. Okay. And when somebody would die in a movie, oh, that was it. There was no blood, no gore, no. And so at a certain point, because we wanted realism, we don't excuse We don't warn anybody if there's small children in the room that they need to leave. We have desensitized ourselves
Yeah,
so we can watch. Oh wait, they're showing somebody get shot by body cam. Wait, I got to watch that body cam. Why have we done that to ourselves?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I think again, I think there's a lot of factors. What I really try to explore in my book is going down to the deepest levels that I have experienced as a psychotherapist. We can talk about the surface of that. It's sensational, it's projection. I mean, and those things are all real and important. But what makes us drawn to that? What happens to people that actually is a form of entertainment rather than horror, like that we should be outraged or horrified or want to do something about that level of profiting off of violence toward other human beings in real time.
Mhm.
um, and so what I really try to look at are abuse family dynamics, both on the individual level. I'll say abuse and dysfunctional family dynamics on the individual level, and how they translate to larger institutions, to within our communities, within our religious organizations, within our schools, within our businesses, and within higher institutions of government, and how there is a correlation between what goes on in a dysfunctional or abusive family and what is getting translated into the larger family systems that we're all influenced by and conditioned by. And so as a therapist of so many years, working with so many people, children, teens, adults, couples, families, you name it, I have to say that abuse and dysfunction is epidemic in our country. We are not a country that prioritizes the health of the family and the well-being of the family. And in fact, in many ways, we deprive families of some of the necessities that they need to function well, whether it's a living wage or access to medical care or easier access to education. I mean, there's justice, all kinds of things that we have problems, severe problems with in America. And families are really suffering high levels of stress, high levels of intergenerational abuse that just gets passed down with no interruption, addiction issues, depression issues, anxiety issues, all kinds of issues that are flooding and really conditioning our families and therefore our children. And without access to good mental health, whether it's even just the access to therapy for a lot of people, but it's way bigger than that. If the family system is not providing well for the individual family, then the family system of America needs to be addressed. And that's really the heart of my book, that we cannot continue to blame our victims. This is what, go ahead, go
Oh, go
ahead.
ahead, go ahead, go ahead, go ahead,
Well,
go ahead.
this is what abusive parents do. They blame their victims or spouses. I hit her because she, talked back. I beat him because he didn't do his homework, or whatever. There's always a justification for that an abuser uses for what they dished out to another person that was really hurtful. And we do that as a country. We blame our poor. We blame the addicts. We blame the people on the street. We blame whatever we do. And we target certain populations more than others. We target certain races. We target gender issues. We target economic classes. We target certain religious groups. And these are abuse family dynamics. There's no justification for abuse. In the world of psychology, you don't fight that, you try to heal it.
Right.
And that's the basic theme of one of them. I mean, I could say 10 basic themes of my book, but that's a big one, is that we have to get out of the paradigm of dominating and suppressing other people and trying to bend them to our will, and move toward a culture that is actually trying to heal our ills. Because when you don't help people, they become symptomatic. Victims of abuse in their own home become symptomatic. whether they become, walled off and isolate, or they become highly aggressive, or they become easily controlled, or they have addiction issues, or, there's a whole long list of issues for people who are treated poorly by other human beings and don't get help and don't get rescue. And if we're targeting whole populations in our country, they're going to be symptomatic. And then it makes no logical sense, but it's also unjust to blame them for their symptoms. And let me, I want to say, well, I want to say a big thing about that, but I want you to chime in before I do that.
No, go ahead. The only thing I was going to say is we've taught, and this is something that's come around in the late 90s, early 2000s, that we, instead of actually talking about our problems and dealing with our problems, here's a pill. It'll fix everything. And that may be true. And some people may need that. But the fact is, you're not still dealing with yourself. And it's like, I was talking to somebody not too long ago. When you move, the first time I moved from New Orleans to Shreveport, I'm like, well, I can start this whole new life. Everything's going to be great. And I was a teenager, so I didn't really fully grasp everything. But the truth of the matter is, wherever you go, you take yourself.
Absolutely.
And so in order to deal with that stuff, you have to heal yourself. A pill's not going to fix. A pill may make you feel better. I'm not going to,
Right.
But in most cases, you're not getting to the root of what caused this.
Well, that's the whole point. And that really is the whole point. And one of the things I can say is that if we look at our culture, and I think this is bigger than the United States, but definitely in our culture, we are we're very adamant that we want our devices fixed. If my phone breaks, I want it to be fixed. If my car breaks, I have no problem going to a car mechanic or a computer specialist or a doctor. If I'm, my appendix is exploding or I'm in pain from a broken leg, I have no problem looking for expert help in all those areas except mental health. There's such a taboo around even looking at that, like, why? And I think we have to ask ourselves that question. Why do we want high-tech everything except high-tech human relations?
I think there's a big, to go to your point, I think because the stigma of the 50s, 60s about mental health was, oh my God, you must be crazy.
Right.
And we talked about this off camera that, yeah, my mom was smart enough that when my parents got divorced and I was acting out, she's like, well, we're going to get you in therapy. Now, my dad would never participate. My dad would never show up. And my dad still will not go to therapy. He needs it. He's had some issues, and I won't go into full detail, but I have talked about his drinking problems in the past. But it's like, I've watched that. But then the other caveat is my mother should have had her own mental health problems. And, you're talking about controlling. And there was an issue one time where I'm a very creative person, and we were living in Shreveport, and I was, I think, 20 years old. And for the time, I was dressing kind of outlandish for Shreveport. And my mother looked at me and she goes, you need to go to the mental health hospital. I'm like, excuse me? She goes, you need to go get checked out. I'm like, why? She's like, because you're just, something's wrong with you. Okay. So I went. And I'm sitting there the whole time questioning my sanity because I'm like, So I go and they do all the little tests. And then the guy's like, why are you here? I said, because my mother said I needed to be here because I was crazy. And he looked at me and goes, you're not crazy. You're creative. He's like, if anything, she's the one that's a little cuckoo and she's going to kill you if you don't get away from her. So I went back home and I told her, I said, Mom, she goes, what'd they say? And I said, that I was creative and that I'm perfectly healthy and mentally fine and I'm normal and I need to move away from you. And she's like, they don't know what they're talking about. Okay. Well, she would end up taking her own life several years later, but that wasn't the first time. I saved her once. But so there was a lot of mental instability with her. Yeah. So when you're dealing with somebody that is mentally unstable, there's that secret trauma because I'll be honest with you, when I think I was a junior in high school and she tried to kill herself and I saved her. And the thing is, all the neighbors came out when the ambulance arrived because she took pills. And the
Yeah.
ambulance comes and the neighbors are all out. And one of our neighbors was brave enough to come across the street and look at me and goes, "So what happened?" And I looked and I was just like, because there's that stigma, and there's still that stigma. Well, she had some food poisoning or something, something was wrong with her. And nobody really thinks about the stigma of, and this doesn't happen often, but you go to a doctor's office and you fill out that questionnaire and it's like, mom, deceased, health issues, deceased, mental illness. How did they die? Suicide. It's like you have to wear that as a badge of honor, even though
Mhm.
it's not. And it's abusive. It's people, I don't want to sound really harsh, but I'm going to. Suicide at a certain point, it depends on how sick they are and how long they are sick. It becomes very abusive and narcissistic because my mother actually wanted me, before she formally did it, she wanted me to come back from Dallas to Shreveport and find her in the shower. She was going to shoot herself in the shower and wanted me to find her. And this is after a whole month of calling me every day. And I couldn't do anything because she was married and my stepfather would not commit her. And I just remember saying to her, if you love me, you wouldn't ask me to do that. Because
Mm.
how twisted and abusive is that? And I
Mhm.
understand she was sick. I'm not taking away from that. But how abusive is
Well,
that?
I think what you're saying is one of the things that's very hard to understand is that the most abusive among us are mentally unwell. People who are mentally well and healthy
Mm-hmm.
do not do things like that.
No.
And one of the outcomes for severe mental illness is abusive behavior and abusive dynamics and abusive relationships with other people. And it's the easiest to abuse people that you have some control over. And that's why it's so frightening to see that happening on larger levels in our country, where there are such extreme power dynamics, economic and political and cultural, and in all realms. And that's why it's so alarming, because if you depend on someone, if you're their child and you depend on them, you're subject to their mental unwellness, and sometimes it takes the form of extremely abusive behaviors, whether it's emotional or physical or sexual or mental or even spiritual, sometimes, or religious. And so, yes, and what you brought up was one of the points that I had wanted to hit on earlier, which is such an important one that I don't think a lot of people understand unless they have some familiarity with psychology. And that is, when people, so your mother made you what's called in psychological language the identified patient. She convinced herself that you were the problem and she sent you to therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And so often, and this is one of the reasons why family therapy was such a breakthrough in the world of psychology, is that we now really understand that people are often expressing family pain through their own behavior. So I don't know why you were dressing the way you were, and it doesn't matter. It wasn't a sign of mental health, but it might have been some kind of call for help, like, pay attention to me. Something's not going so well in my home.
I wanted to be in a band. So it was more of creating a persona than being outlandish as far as crazy.
Yeah. In any case, so you're not the most severe example by any means, but in any case, your mother made you the identified patient, and you were fortunate enough to have a therapist who didn't buy it, who could see that your mother was really the issue. That's not always the case. But when I worked with children, I was telling you this earlier, in the beginning of my practice, I worked almost exclusively with children. And they were almost always sent to therapy for some kind of symptom, like they had fears, or they were wetting the bed, or they were not, getting along with their siblings, or they were aggressive at school, or they were failing at school, or something that called attention to them. And it looked like they were the one that needed therapy. But inevitably, what I would find was it was the parents that needed therapy. And most often, the children were suffering from either extreme conflict at home between their parents or a divorce. And often it was a divorce, and a conflictual divorce. And divorce is traumatic for children, regardless of whether it's conflictual or not, but often it's conflictual. And so in the world of family therapy, we call them the identified patient. They're the one that brought the family to therapy. And a good therapist, like your therapist, took you out of that role immediately and identified the problem where it really lay, which was some kind of mental health issue with your mother. And often what happens when children are sent to therapy is that the family issues are what actually is identified as what needs to be treated. So if we take that lens and we look at our country that way, who are the identified patients in our country? Who are the ones that are most symptomatic? And we have some highly symptomatic people in this country. We have people who are committing multiple murders of strangers. We have people who are dying in the streets of overdoses or selling drugs to children, who are trafficking little children into sex, who are embezzling, who, the list goes on and on. We have highly symptomatic people. Could they be calling for help for the family of America the way a symptomatic child does in their own family? And I think we have to see them that way. It doesn't mean we don't hold them responsible for what they're doing, but we have to understand that they weren't born a murderer.
Well, my question for you then is some of these people that are acting out, we go back to something you talked about earlier, is it the ancestral traumatic trauma that has never been dealt with? Because I mean, there are days, and yes, I still have a therapist because I lost my husband and everything else, but there's still days where my mom can get in my head and tell me play those games. So if a person, for me, I deal with my crap, but for the person that doesn't deal with their crap and they constantly still hear their dad saying they're a POS, or
Right.
they or how else are they, I'm never going to amount to anything, so I might as well go do this.
Right. I think that's absolutely what we're dealing with on a continuum of severity and a continuum to incredible severity. Yes, absolutely. And so that's why I say it is a mental health problem for our country. Where do we need to begin? Because the other half of that is part of it's the diagnosis, and we're touching on some of the high points, and there's lots of other points that we won't have time to discuss. But if there is a cycle of abuse that continues if it's not broken, and we know that there is a cycle of abuse that will continue if it's not broken, and yes, there are people who just don't fit that mold. There are people who somehow rise from the ashes and they lead these stellar lives, even if they've come from a horrific background. But we have to know that there's hundreds of thousands of people who
Well,
don't rise from the ashes, who continue something, whether they're acting out on themselves or the people around them or their employees or the people who voted for them.
the one thing I find often, I mean, for me, when I worked in insurance, I started out as a mail file clerk, and then I worked my way up to a claim supervisor. So I understood what it was like to be the little person. And sometimes I think when we're looking at politics, we'll just touch on that for a second. When you have politicians saying, well, it's too much to pay for somebody's childcare, or it's too much to pay for somebody's food. Have you been in their situation? Do you
Yeah.
understand? Do you have empathy? And I think, in a way, if you want to run for office, if you want to run for office, if you want to be in that position of power, then guess what? For at least a month, you give everything up, and you live at least for a couple of days, if not a week, like a homeless person.
Yeah.
You live with kids that don't have food, and you
That's right.
experience that, because then you're truly going to understand the plight of your constituents and not beholden to corporations that are writing these bills out and only care about their bottom line.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And these are also mental health issues.
Mm-hmm.
When you don't have empathy for the pain of other human beings and their children And I really want to emphasize the children, because the children are having no choice. They're in these homes and they're going to grow up with the scars of what's been inflicted on them and what's been withheld from them. So, absolutely. And the lack of empathy is one of the outcomes of an abusive family dynamic.
Mhm.
An abuser doesn't have empathy, they don't teach that to the people around them. So if you are one of the people in an abusive home, whether it's an abusive household or an abusive community, or if you're being targeted for discrimination because of the color of your skin or your race or your religion or your gender, um, you are being treated by an abusive culture. You're internalizing the shame and blame and hostility of an abusive culture. And for some people, it kills the empathy inside of them, because it doesn't work to have all your tender, loving feelings out to be tromped on
Right.
and hide them away. Um, and whether you become self-protective and easily controlled, or you become someone who identifies with the aggressor. But in the bottom line is, an abusive culture breaks the bonds of human connection. And we have to have those bonds of human connection to feel empathy and compassion for others. And the more that this kind of mushroom cloud of abuse dynamics accelerates in our country, we're killing off empathy for one another, which is the foundation for healthy human relationships and healthy children and a healthy future, and maybe even a viable future.
The one thing we didn't touch on about abuse though is the abuse sometimes can turn you into, I have to try to fix, I have to try to save, I have to try to do everything to make you right. And I think you can, I mean, I hate to say this, but I know quite a few people. The key word to somebody who has been in an abusive relationship is the fact when they will continually say, I'm sorry. Because basically that term I'm sorry comes to a point where it's like, why are you sorry? Are you sorry for the fact that you exist?
Are you talking about the abuser or the person who's
The
abused?
person that was abused, the person, the aftermath of that person being abused, the child being abused, and the consistently saying after the fact, as an adult, I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that we look at that enough and say, because when you look at that person's usually sorry for nothing. They're sorry because they may have said something that they interpreted it to be said wrong, even though it's not.
Or
They are
they're so used to taking the blame that
right.
they really believe. I mean, I've worked with so many people who have been abused as children who really believed that they deserved the abuse, because that was the message, whether it was overt or implicit, that they did something that warranted what happened to them. And when you have people, many people, who have internalized blame for what's happened to them, and many people do internalize the blame, um, then they can be more easily controlled by others, because they're so willing to take responsibility for something that's not theirs. So there are many outcomes to an abuse family dynamic. That's one of them. And it's just as dangerous, if maybe not more as obviously, but it's just as dangerous as someone who identifies with the aggressor and becomes abusive or over controlling themselves. And what we see in the world of therapy is that someone who has identified with the aggressor on some level, who seeks control and domination, will invariably be attracted to someone who can be dominated.
Well, it's
And
sorry.
go ahead. Go ahead.
It's the people pleaser. You become the people pleaser, and you relinquish control, because it's much easier to relinquish that control because you want to avoid confrontation at any given avenue, because you've experienced confrontation so often.
That's right.
So it's much easier to become the people pleaser and say I'm sorry, because that's just, and that's the other, it's like you have this fine line when you're dealing it. And most people say, well, no, you had the idyllic childhood, you weren't abused, blah, blah, blah. But the truth is that a lot of this abuse can be mental, and it can be not
Absolutely.
necessarily the quintessential abuse you see on TV. And
Right.
so that therefore, like you said, we have this bigger thing to look at. And the other thing is, that we didn't touch on is I can look at, because my grandmother helped raise me at times, and I look at my grandmother as how she raised me, and then I look at my mom, and I'm like, how did my mom turn out this? But the fact of the matter is, my grandmother had time to grow, mellow, mature,
Mm.
and I don't think we can't judge. When I look at I found out something recently because somebody did some ancestry. My dad's mother lost her real mother at 3 years old. And so she was brought up by her stepmother, and her dad was an atrocious beast, from what I know. Now, knowing that, I can look at it and go, okay, so I understand where her trauma was, and I understand where she passed it on to my father. I
Mhm.
can look at it differently, but that's part of this whole thing. If you're not willing to sit there and take the rose colored glasses off and see your parents as being the people that they are, and not just mom and dad, oh, it's so great. Who were they? And
Mhm.
and how did they, because they're not treating your grandkids the same.
Right.
So you have to look at them and then try to look at their family and see the bigger picture of what was their mental health like. I mean, my grandmother would brag when she was my dad's mom. We went that she had come up here to live with us for a bit, and she's sitting there telling my husband how she used to take casserole before she went to a party or went out drinking because she could drink them in under the table. Oh, okay. And she's bragging about this, but in the back of my head, I'm like, okay, so this explains why dad is capable of doing this. For me, watching him do that made me go, no, because to me, it was obvious that if he could do that, I certainly could do it. And my mom's dad was a drinker as well. So it was just like, mm-mm. I've seen the
Mhm.
nastiness. My dad was a
Mhm.
happy drunk for the most part, but I've seen both sides, and no.
Yeah. Well, you bring up another really important point, and that's one of the beauties of the whole world of psychology, and why I think it's so important for us to bring this lens to America and to our larger institutions, is that we look for the origins, we look for the history. And the whole point is not to blame anyone. It really isn't. It's to heal. The more information you have about where you came from and what conditioned you and what the outcome of that was for you, what you came to believe about yourself, what coping mechanisms you adopted, what you came to have as expectations of yourself and others, what you would tolerate and what you don't, who you're attracted to and who you're not. All of this can be, there's no perfect formula, but we can understand it better if we understand our history. And that's some of the access to healing is, oh, maybe I was brought up to believe that, whatever, I'll just make something up. I was brought up to believe that the only role for a woman is to be a meek little wife and do whatever her husband says. That wasn't my
Yeah,
upbringing, but
I
it
get
is
it.
for some people. um and you believe that unless you can unless you're in enough pain about having taken that on, that you're willing to do some work and unpack layers of what conditioned you to believe that. Because inside each person is an essential self that doesn't have any of those beliefs. They're just kind of layers that get put on us from the conditioning that we have. And so one of the things that I think we really need as a country is to look at our own history. We come from, you know, immigrants, except for the Native Americans who were here, who we have massively traumatized.
Yeah.
We come from largely from people who were also traumatized, people who were prisoners, people who were fleeing persecution or poverty, or religious, injustice and persecution. And we brought our traumas with us. And we know none of those people got help for their traumas. The world of psychology didn't even exist. And so all of that got passed down intergenerationally, and is being acted out today. And so when we talk about America in therapy, we're really talking about not from blame, but actually with compassion. We have a long history of coming from people who were suffering at the hands of other people, and we have perpetrated a lot of suffering. And that's also part of what the best psychology and the best psychotherapy does, is like, even, I don't know about you, but I can say I've hurt people in my life. I didn't mean to. I don't think
Oh,
I'm an essentially mean person, but I've hurt people out of ignorance, out of my own wounds, out of jealousy or envy, or, just whatever, my own hurt, whatever. And it's very hard, I think, for many people to look at that part. We can look at who hurt us, but it's harder to look at who we've hurt or that we've hurt. But again, it's not with like blame and punishment. The whole lens of psychotherapy and psychology is healing. Okay, so, I misspoke to this person and I had a snappy tone of voice. I did that with my husband this morning, you know, and then I heard myself and I was like, I'm sorry. I really don't mean to talk so grumpy to you. And we can learn how to do that because that heals relationship. And we can learn how to do that as a country. And it would be massive if we did.
well, I think also you have to come to the fact that not everybody is going to like you and that you sometimes are going to be the villain, even if you don't intend to be. Sometimes because you didn't do something for somebody the way they wanted it done, you
Right.
might be the villain in their story. There's one statement that I really, and I don't know how you feel, one statement that always grinds my gears, and that's feelings are not facts. And while that may be true, that feelings are not facts. There are how you feel. And I think when people say feelings are not facts, you're dismissing a whole bunch of truth there. Because if it doesn't matter if it's not factual, if I'm feeling that way, isn't that a fact that I'm feeling that way?
Well, I think what's important is that it's important that you're feeling that way. And, how I feel about the weather might be different than the fact that it's lightning and thunder out there. And it's a fact that it's lightning and thunder out there. And this is kind of a stupid example,
No, but
but I might have lots of feelings about that. I might be scared. Maybe
mhm.
lightning almost hit me when I was a child or whatever happened. So, I think what happens, what's behind that statement is that we still try to control each other with our language.
Mhm.
That dismisses a whole realm of human experience in one statement,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And we do this all the time. I wrote a chapter in my book on the language around victims and survivors, because it became very unpopular to say you were a victim. Somehow, if you said you were a victim, you were a whiner, or you weren't willing to get up and try again, or you are staying too long and playing the sympathy card, or whatever you're doing that has a negative connotation. And then people had to say they were survivors of abuse. And the word survivor is fabulous. We want to survive these things. It's a very important word. We don't want to stay in a place of feeling victimized for our whole life. But that's not the point. The point is that if you were truly victimized, it's okay to say that. If you beat me, I can say I'm a victim of physical violence. And then I might be learning how to survive the aftermath of that, and more power to me or whoever is actually learning how to survive the terrible effects of whatever happened that was their victimization. But I think we have to be very careful about the use of language. And what you said was a really good example of that. It's like, if I can only say I'm a survivor, then I can't say you hurt me. And we have to be able to say, you hurt me.
Well, and the interesting thing, I was talking to somebody today about this very thing because our brain, especially when we're younger, because I know for a while there, that was the other big thing. Somebody would suddenly remember that they were sexually abused, or somebody would suddenly remember, and it was like, oh, well, that can't be true. But I was talking to somebody about the fact that I had gotten into it with my stepfather. I was about 20 years old, and I had said something to him to set him off. And he got up from the kitchen table, and I was by my bedroom, and he pushed me up against the bedroom, the hall wall, and put his hands around my throat. And there was scratching, there was some, okay. But my mom tells me, she says, well, If you call the cops, I can't do anything. I'm not going to do anything. If he kicks you out, I can't do anything. I'm like, okay, fine. So I have no, but wait.
Okay.
There's a reason for the story, and but that I know that all sounds awful, but there's a reason for the story. So for a long time, when I talked about this, because ultimately, he kneed me in the groin when I clawed his face. That's how he finally released my grasp because I clawed him. But the fact is, I would sit there and say I had a physical altercation with him. I did not own it. My mind would not let me own it. I hit, I think, 40 something years old, and I watch Law and Order all the time. I've watched crime dramas, and it was something about the exact scene that somebody got pushed up against the wall, hands went around her throat, and they were like, "That's attempted murder." And all of a sudden, the 40-year-old mind could process what the 20-year-old mind couldn't. And it was
Wow.
like, that wasn't a physical altercation. The man tried to kill you. His hands were around your throat.
Yeah.
And so I think, going back to the victimization that people are like, oh, that's repressed. That's all. No,
No.
our mind will not let us process things. It's like the issue. And I've talked about this on the show. So I know you're like, why should I've talked about some of this, but like my mom was like, oh, she knew this about him. I did not. She's like, let him give you a pedicure. He loves giving pedicures and he'll even buy you a nice pair of shoes.
Mm,
Okay, I'm 17 years old. I don't know any better. Okay, fine. Yes, it's grooming now. I know this, but at the time, didn't even think about it. My husband passed away. I'm talking to one of my friends about finding videotapes after my mom died of my mother's feet. And I'm like, all of a sudden, even though this was years before that I found the videotapes and I didn't put two and two together, all of a sudden now it's like this light bulb goes off and I'm like, he had a foot fetish and she let him touch my feet. What in the And then she would accuse me later on of sleeping with him, which I never did. I couldn't stand him. But the whole fact of the matter is,
yeah.
she put her daughter into this man who has a foot fetish. How screwed up is that? But it goes back to something you said about me being the patient, because her doing that then allowed her at a moment to say, I must have slept with him because obviously he has that foot fetish.
Mm-hmm. And I would just say your mother was severely disturbed,
Yeah.
really, really disturbed in a very threatening and harmful way to you. And that is, what we have to look at in our homes, in our communities, and in our larger institutions, that your mother had power over you. And there are people in positions of power today who are really unhealed from whatever wounded them and set them up to have no empathy, to target other people, to hurt other people, to withhold from other people, you name it. And I think we have to identify that in our homes, in our communities, and in our country. And on a very fundamental layman's level language of psychological health and ill health. And that's really what I'm trying to do in my book.
I 100% agree. And I think that's, when we talk about the family, there's a friend that I know that had in vitro and she should never have been a parent. She reminded me a lot of my mother. And I'm thinking, why do we not have psychological tests for that?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know that people are like, well, you can have a kid anytime, but are you really capable of having a child? Are you really if you're having a child to fix a relationship, that's not a reason to have a child. If you're having a child because you think you deserve it and you think that kid's going to give you unconditional love, that is not right either, because you're setting those kids up to be
Mm-hmm.
mentally abused. And so that's where I have to ask, this goes back to exactly what we're talking about, because it's like, if you have these people that are not capable of being nurturing, how are these kids going to have nurturing? I mean, I got raised by several different people, so I fortunately had
Yeah.
other avenues.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Definitely.
to be in that situation, and here's the thing about that, because I had my mother, that friend that I talked about, she reminded me a lot of my mother. And
Mm-hmm.
so we tend to,
Yeah.
and this goes back to your point, we tend to, until we start healing those poor parts of ourselves from those abusers, we will tend to pick those same people over and over and over again.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what's scary about it is it can have terrible repercussions in your own life, especially if you're picking someone who is abusive of you, and many people do, just out of their conditioning, not because they're bad people or stupid or anything.
Right.
They're running on an automatic psychological pilot. Um, but part of what's really frightening about that is that if you have many people coming out of homes where they've identified with the aggressor as a way to survive, they're more likely to identify with the bully on the playground. They're more likely to identify with the bully running for office. And this is very, very scary for our country. And so for me, the call is really like, let's look at our mental health from the ground floor up. Let's begin to provide for families. Let's demand of our lawmakers and people in positions of power that they heal their own wounds, that they abide by certain rules of just respect and nonviolence, and model for our young people what we all want in our own families and in our own homes for ourselves.
I
But this
often
is a lot of work. We're talking about a lot of
Oh, it
work.
is. I mean, I had the discussion many times when a certain person was running for office that you think this person is going to be there for you when they have a golden toilet.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't equate. It doesn't with the critical thinking. It does not equate because a person with a golden toilet is not going to be there for to help lift somebody else up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that goes back to the empathy thing. Um, I also, before we go, because I know we still have a little bit of time, I did want to touch on your other two books. You have Into the Fire and A Light in the Darkness. And you said that you basically got these books from Receiving Divine Source Connection. And I do read and I do tarot. So
Oh,
I do intuitive reading. So this is why that was kind of like, well, besides the mental health aspect, if you don't mind sharing a little bit of this would be
I
great.
don't. Those books I wrote those two books not that long ago, but maybe, I don't know, 10 years ago, or a little less actually. And they're very autobiographical in a certain way. I had some abuse and trauma in my own childhood, and it caused me a lot of suffering. And that's probably why I'm so sensitive to the issue. And I think it also gives me a lot of insight into the ramifications of abuse and neglect if it's not treated. And fortunately, by the time I was in my mid-30s, people were talking about psychology and psychotherapy and going to therapy. And I finally went to therapy, and it really changed my life because I began to remember what happened to me, and I began a long process of healing. And how I would say what was so valuable in 2 words, what I shared in those books is I shared some of where I came from and what life was like for me before I got any help. And also that what I had said earlier, I'm going to highlight now, which is I really believe we all have an essential self, something that was there in us before we were written on by the conditioning that we got from our parents, from our world around us and our communities and whatever else we were influenced by. And that I think the best psychological work really helps a person reconnect to their most essential self. And our most essential self, I have never seen this not be true, and I'm certainly open to hearing somebody else's story. But with all the people that I've ever worked with or known who have made that journey to uncover, who they really are and who they really want to be, I have never seen that be a monster in there. It's always a loving, caring, connected human being who has empathy for others and compassion for themselves, to some degree. None of us do it perfectly, but that essential self is also very wise. That essential self actually really knows things that we're not allowed to know by the family systems that we grew up in. And so in those two books, I really wrote about when I got in touch with that essential self in me, and it felt very spiritual. I got a lot of messages about what the truth was for me. And that's what I share in those books. And it was an amazing journey. It has been. It's not an over journey, but it also has really informed me as a psychotherapist. Those worlds are actually not separate. When you connect to yourself, you connect to wisdom on all levels. And so a lot of what I connected to in myself and in my own healing process, I put in a certain form for America in Therapy because I really want to speak to a wide audience. And I'm speaking through the lens of psychology, but I actually believe those worlds are very connected, if that
They
makes
are.
sense.
No,
Yeah.
they are. I mean, I've talked to a neuroscientist who talked about how we are all connected via energy. And
Yeah.
I dumbed it down to Star Wars with the Force because that's the easiest way, but it's true. I mean, there's certain things, if you are connected to your higher self, if you're connected, you will get intuitively, you will know things. Intuitively, you will
That's right.
understand things.
That's right.
And I remember, I think it was it was a little over a year ago. I kept saying I was going on a trip and I'm like, I need to stay at this certain hotel because I need access to the elevators. And my friends are like, why do you need that? I'm like, because I do. And I would say this for months and months and months. And so finally, when the day came, uh, I was I got told I was sitting in sitting in the lobby and I was like, you need to go upstairs and get something to eat. I'm like, all right, fine. So I got up and I got distracted and I went back to the elevator, hit the button, and somebody I wanted to see walked out of the elevator at that moment. And I was just like, okay, so see, this is why I needed access to the elevator.
Yeah.
And there's things that, yeah,
Yeah.
it made sense to me. My friends were all like, whatever. But in my core, in my soul, I knew
Yeah.
that was the answer. And I think that if we trusted ourselves more, that's the one thing, goes back to the initial part of our conversation. We are taught because of control. And you can't talk. And I mean, there's that fine line with psychotherapy that if you're getting information, so like driving along, hearing slow down and going around a curve and slowing down because traffic's at a dead stop. But when you hear that little voice, it's not the same as hearing voices.
That's
It's
right. It's
and
not the
that's
same at all.
but that's the problem. We the media and the general world has painted if you hear those things, then it's wrong.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's got to be a
I'm controlling people, but that don't listen to yourself, listen to me.
right.
That's a huge weapon of control. And it's unfortunate because, often little children are highly intuitive. And if they were listened to and honored in their perceptions, and they could grow up staying in touch with that part of themselves, and so we have to do the work of uncovering it and peeling back the layers and getting back in touch with it. But those parts of us can be incredibly wise. And I'll just say this really quickly. I have a client that I worked with for many years who had terrible, terrible abuse. And we worked together for a really long time. And as her therapy wound down, she made a very powerful connection within herself that she would call spiritual, I would call it. And it just came out of her work of peeling back the layers of what happened. And so we don't want to separate those worlds and make one world kind of like, suspect or crazy or, doubtful or whatever, because we actually all really do know somewhere inside of us. And the best therapy will help you uncover that.
Mm-hmm. And I will say there is hope for the younger generation because I do work out of a store occasionally, and I've watched a little kid walk over to the crystals and hold the crystals and know, and feel the vibration. And then her mom sat down and I did a reading for her mom, and she's like, "Yeah, my daughter's intuitive." My daughter tells me one night, she's like, yeah, dinner's going to be free tonight. And she's like, no, it's not. We're going to a restaurant that's not going to be free. So lo and behold, they go to dinner and it's something ends up happening. The manager's like, oh, your dinner's free.
Oh, I love it. I
And so,
just love those
so
stories.
there's more parents now, I think, that are more willing to be open to listen to their kids. They had one that was like, yeah, I constantly doubted her, but she keeps getting right. So I'm like, then you need to listen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because if that's fostered there, it's gonna help them be better leaders and better people as they grow older.
And it's going to help them be people who will listen to others,
Mm-hmm.
which is what we desperately need.
Yeah, we definitely do.
Desperately. Yeah.
Definitely do. So, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would like to
Oh,
say?
yes, there's chapters we haven't talked about, but that's fine.
Well,
That's fine.
I thank you for coming on. It's been a very fascinating interview.
Thank you so much for having me. I feel the same. Just lovely talking to you.
So, if you're a regular listener to the show, the stuff I shared, you've heard it before, and it's not shock and awe. And it was more about proving how sometimes we can bury things. Sometimes we don't really want to face things. And yes, the stigma of mental health. And while it has improved, much improved, that people don't have such stigma about, oh my gosh, I can't deal. We're more open to getting therapy. We're more open to facing what is troubling us. And that is growth. That is growth. That's healing. That's potential for change, potential for a new life. But as she said, we have to look at it in a more dynamic, bigger picture, because the traumas that are consistently repeated daily because we have no empathy for other people, well, that is a problem, because nobody needs to be suffering for the reasons that they're suffering. We can all work together and make this country and this world a much better place. And then I know somebody's like, oh, here she is on her soapbox again. But that's the truth. If we could all actually face things and really look at it, and look at our parents and look at our families and look at the place where we work. And I'm not saying being judgmental about it. I'm saying actually look, dive deep, understand why you're doing what you're doing in your life, and realize that maybe it's still from the past. Maybe it's something I need to heal, something I need to let go. And I'll be honest, I'm on that journey right now myself still. And I'm trying to rediscover a new way of life for me. And how do I rediscover a new way of life? Because I had a life that I kind of liked before I met my husband. So I'm rediscovering that part of my life, but I'm rediscovering a different version of me, a side of me that doesn't have to be trapped by items of clutter, or items of things that don't matter, or even memories that just are painful. By facing them and healing that, I can move on. Now, as I said earlier, though, even if we heal, sometimes that tape comes back, and we've talked about that before. So today, if something's bothering you, reach out to somebody, talk to them, get a therapist, but get to the root of the problem. Because while medication's great and medication can help you feel better, figure out what really is going on. Is it the bully that was in school with you that made you feel like shit? Is it the person that put you in front of the class and embarrassed the hell out of you? Is it your parents that may have said something to you that you weren't worthwhile? Whatever it is that creates your own negative self-talk, that makes you feel less than you are, know that you're worthy. Know that you're worth it. And turn the chatter off. Face them. Sit down. Imagine having the conversation that you really wanted to have with them if they're not here, or you can't ever face them because who's going to go dig up the old bully? But be that protector for the person that was there, that came at you, that you didn't protect at the time. Be the protector. Heal that side of you. So, on that note, if you want to be a guest on the Better Two podcast, you can drop me a line at Donna, at DAUNA, at better2podcast.com. As always, the sound and audio is done by Rich Zai of Third Ear Audio. So on that note, guys, I hope you have a great day, and I'll catch you next time. Bye. The Better Two podcast is mixed, edited, and produced by Rich Zai of Third Ear Audio Productions.